So what if the ultimate villain of the human story, like the great antagonist that humanity has been warned about for millennia, what if that isn't actually some external political figure?
Right. Which is, a pretty wild thought to start with.
It is, because, I mean, just think about human psychology for a second. We we love external monsters.
Oh, absolutely.
We build our entire cultural mythology around them, from like ancient dragons to modern geopolitical tyrants.
Yeah, we like to be able to point at the bad guy.
Exactly. We're constantly scanning the horizon,
Yeah?
you know, watching the headlines, just waiting for a singular dictator to rise to power in some distant capital. But what if that entire outward posture is just a fatal misdirection?
A total distraction.
Yeah, what if the real threat, like the true architect of the apocalypse, is actually an internal posture,
Hmm?
like an insidious, quiet attitude hidden deep within the sanctuary of your own mind?
I mean, that framing, it just completely flips the eschatological script, and by that I mean the theology of the end times.
Right, the study of the last days.
Exactly. Because we are so heavily conditioned, just by our biology and survival instinct, to look outward for danger.
Yeah, if there's a tiger, you want to see the tiger.
Right. If
Yeah.
there is a threat, we assume we're going to be able to see it, marching down the street or legislating from a recognizable throne. But if the threat is if the enemy is the very mechanism you use to perceive the world, well, that requires a completely different kind of vigilance.
Because you can't just look out a window to see it.
Exactly. It demands a level of self-interrogation that, frankly, most people spend their entire lives actively avoiding.
Which makes this the perfect, albeit slightly terrifying, starting point for our deep dive today.
It really is.
So we have a profoundly complex piece of source material to unpack for you today. It's this intensely theological and really structurally rigid essay titled The Lawless One in the Temple, The Crucified Life.
And it is a heavy text.
Very heavy.
Yeah.
And I want to pause right here to frame our approach for the listener, because this text is a highly charged theological critique of modern culture.
It really pulls no punches.
None at all. It zeroes in heavily on the LGBTQ plus pride movement alongside, a host of other modern phenomena.
Mm.
So if you're listening right now, I want to be super clear. Our goal today isn't to take a side.
Right.
We aren't here to wave a flag or endorse the author's viewpoint or condemn anyone's viewpoint. Our mission is it's pure forensic analysis.
Yeah, we're just dissecting the argument.
Exactly. We are neutral guides. We're cracking open the architecture of this argument to see exactly how the author connects ancient biblical prophecy to modern cultural shifts, regardless of where you personally stand on these debates.
And that's a vital clarification. Because to actually understand a text like this, you have to temporarily step inside its worldview.
Right. You have to look at the blueprints from the inside.
Yes. You have to operate its machinery. You have to understand its axioms. And the central foundational axiom of this author's thesis is it's wild in its implications.
Break that down for us.
So they argue that the ultimate crisis of the last days is not an architectural crisis. Like, it's not about a literal stone building in the Middle East.
Okay.
And it's not merely a political crisis about global governance either.
So no one world government kind of stuff.
Right. They argue it is an intensely personal crisis of occupancy. The author claims that the lawless one, which is, this classic biblical figure of ultimate rebellion, is actually the human ego.
Wow. Wait, the ego?
The ego. It is the self, seated in the biological body, calling itself righteous.
Okay, that completely derails how a lot of people traditionally understand end times prophecy.
Right.
I mean, if you grew up in certain religious traditions, you might be really familiar with passages like 2 Thessalonians 2.
Well, yeah, a very famous passage.
Right. It warns about the man of sin sitting in the temple of God. And for generations, theologians have treated that as like a geopolitical blueprint.
A literal architectural schematic.
Yeah. They've been waiting for a physical stone and mortar temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem so that, a literal man in a suit or a military uniform can walk in and declare himself God.
And the author argues that this literalist outward fixation is a tragic distraction.
A distraction from what?
From the actual spiritual blade of the text. The author performs this really fascinating theological synthesis to prove this point. They take that prophecy from 2 Thessalonians, the man of sin in the temple, and they run it through the filter of 1 John 2.18.
Which says what exactly?
It declares that even now are there many antichrists.
Oh, well, I see.
Right. So right out the gate, the author is completely dismantling the idea of a singular future James Bond-style villain.
Because if there are many antichrists,
Exactly. If there are many, and the mystery of lawlessness is an active current pattern rather than just a future event, then we are looking at a spiritual posture, not a politician.
okay, but the real linchpin of this entire argument, the verse that like changes the entire geography of the apocalypse, is 1 Corinthians 6:19.
Yes, that is the cornerstone of the whole essay.
That's the famous declaration that the human body is the temple of the Holy Ghost. So when you fuse those ideas together,
It changes everything.
it really does. Like,
Yeah.
the Antichrist is a present pattern, the lawless one sits in the temple, and your body is the temple. The math changes instantly.
It forces a total internal pivot. The Berean question, meaning, the question asked by the diligent seeker of truth, it shifts. It goes from a geographical inquiry to a psychological and spiritual one.
So instead of looking at a map,
Right. You stop asking, where is the temple being built?
yeah.
And you start asking, who currently occupies the temple of my own body?
Wait, so if I'm looking at this as like a priestly question, you're saying my brain isn't just a biological processing center.
Not in this framework, no.
My consciousness isn't just a secular space where I can think whatever I want without consequence. The author is arguing that the mind is a literal altar.
That is the exact theological mechanism the author is pointing to. The body is not merely biological material. It's not just meat, bone, and neurochemistry animated by survival instincts.
Right.
And it is certainly not an autonomous vehicle for personal expression. In this framework, the body is holy property.
It has an owner.
It has an owner.
Yeah.
Therefore, every single desire, every passing thought, every political grievance or sexual impulse is not a private, secular occurrence.
It's a deeply priestly issue.
Exactly.
So basically, when I sit around quietly obsessing over my own career ambitions or like nursing a grudge against a coworker, I'm not just having a bad day. Under this logic, I am actively burning incense to myself in the Holy of Holies.
Precisely the author's point.
Huh.
And this really highlights the danger of what the text calls the righteous spectator.
The righteous spectator, what is that?
Well, when you focus exclusively on external prophecies, you insulate yourself from judgment. You sit in your living room, watching cable news, pointing your finger at corrupt politicians or global empires.
Convinced that the lawless one is out there doing all the damage.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the crisis has already happened inside you.
Oh, wow. Like the call is coming from inside the house.
Yes. Your ego, your desires, your political leanings, or even your religious self-righteousness, it has climbed onto the throne of your moral imagination, grabbed the gavel, and declared itself the ultimate authority.
The temple has been occupied.
It's been occupied by an idol, and that idol is named me.
Okay, so if the occupier of the temple is this idol called me, the author doesn't just leave it as an abstract psychological concept, right? They give this internal posture a very specific, universally understood name.
They do. They call it pride.
But they completely strip away the modern therapeutic definition of the word.
Yes, and the semantic drift of the word pride over the last century is really crucial to understand here.
What do you mean by semantic drift?
Well, in our modern therapeutic vernacular, pride is viewed as a necessary and positive psychological baseline.
Right.
It's the opposite of toxic shame.
Right, like if you've been marginalized or bullied or beaten down by life, finding pride in yourself is celebrated.
Exactly. It's seen as a milestone of mental health. It's taking ownership of your self-worth.
But the author refuses to engage with that psychological framing.
Completely refuses. They evaluate pride strictly through a metaphysical, biblical lens.
And in that lens, pride isn't just a feeling of quiet satisfaction after you like ace a test or finally run a marathon.
No, not at all.
The author defines it as the ultimate act of self-enthronement. It's the ego standing up and declaring, I am the captain now. I am the reference point for reality.
The text leans really heavily on Proverbs 16.5 here, which states, everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord.
Wow. An abomination.
Notice the absolute severity of that language. The text doesn't classify pride as a minor character defect. It's not like being a little too talkative or slightly unpunctual.
Right, it's not a quirk.
It classifies the proud heart as an abomination. The author argues that pride is a fundamental architecture of rebellion.
The architecture of rebellion. That's a strong phrase.
It is the ego stating, I am the truth of myself. I have the ultimate authority to define my own parameters of love, my own standard of righteousness, and I dictate what the universe must affirm about me.
So it's essentially a hostile takeover.
Yes. When a human mind adopts that posture, it ceases to be a created being in submission to a creator. It attempts to become its own God.
Okay, but I can hear a listener, especially one who's familiar with the biblical source material, hitting the brakes right here.
Oh, for sure.
They might be thinking, hold on, doesn't the Bible actually encourage a certain kind of boasting? Like, doesn't the Apostle Paul talk about boasting in what God has done?
Yeah, the concept of glorying or boasting in the Lord.
Exactly. So how does the author reconcile this idea of a totally annihilated ego with the biblical concept of finding glory or boasting?
It's a really vital counterargument, and the author anticipates it by drawing an incredibly sharp, uncompromising line between the concept of stewardship and the concept of authorship.
Stewardship versus authorship.
Yeah.
Unpack that for us.
Well, the text utilizes Ephesians 2:10, which declares, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works." The author argues that boasting in the Lord does not inflate the ego, it actively dismantles it.
Because to boast in the Lord is essentially a confession of bankruptcy.
Precisely.
You are admitting you aren't the source code of your own goodness.
Exactly. You are confessing that you are not the author of your own strength, or your own intellect, or your own righteousness. Man is a steward, an inheritor.
You receive breath, you receive a body.
And according to this theology, you receive moral commands and works that were prepared for you beforehand.
Okay, let me try an analogy here. It's the difference between, say, a real estate developer standing in front of a skyscraper and saying, look at this magnificent structure I built from the ground up.
Right.
Versus a security guard standing in the lobby of that exact same building saying, look at this magnificent structure I've been trusted to keep clean.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
One claims authorship and demands worship. The other claims stewardship and deflects the glory back to the architect.
That analogy captures the essence of the essay's theology perfectly. The ultimate rebellion is to look at your biological life, your innate desires, or your chosen identity and say, look what I made myself to be. I am my own meaning.
Because you're claiming to be the developer, not the guard?
Exactly. Boasting in God empties the ego because it requires absolute dependence. Pride, on the other hand, demands absolute autonomy. And the author points out that the biblical text flatly rejects human autonomy with the blunt statement, you are not your own.
Wow. Okay, so having established this universal, intensely theological definition of pride as the self-enthroned ego, the essay shifts. It moves from the abstract to the concrete.
And this is where it gets very specific.
Right. It zeroes in on how this ancient mechanism manifests in modern culture, taking direct aim at the LGBTQ+ pride movement. And again, as we navigate this, for you listening, we are just looking at the mechanics of the author's logic here.
We are tracing the argument.
Exactly. How does this text actually bridge the gap between an ancient proverb about a proud heart and a modern civil rights movement?
The author builds this bridge by arguing that the modern movement represents what they term a twofold abomination.
Twofold, meaning two different issues combining.
Right. It is the precise intersection of two entirely different streams of biblical condemnation. First, they point to Leviticus 18.22, which is the traditional text condemning same-sex sexual functions.
Okay.
Now, the author is careful to stress that God judges by the fundamental function and the act itself, not by modern branding or sociology or the acronyms that humanity invented thousands of years later.
So that is the first stream, the baseline condemnation of the physical behavior.
Correct.
And the second stream is the posture. It's the Proverbs condemnation of the proud heart that we just spent time discussing.
Yes. The author argues that when you take a sexual function that the biblical text explicitly condemns and you publicly crown it, institutionalize it, and literally name it pride.
Which the text also explicitly condemns as the ultimate posture of rebellion.
Exactly. When you do that, those two streams collide. The essay acknowledges that prohibited desires have existed since the dawn of humanity, like sin, disorder, internal temptation. They aren't new.
They are the baseline condition of the fallen world.
Right. The critical escalation, the apocalyptic danger, in the author's view, is the enthronement of that desire.
The danger isn't just that someone, in a private moment, struggles with the desire. The danger is that the desire is given a throne, a flag, and a public relations department.
Precisely. It is named, celebrated, fiercely protected as a core identity, marched into the public square, and the culture at large is forced to bow and offer societal affirmation.
It's mandated.
Mandated. That is the synthesis of the author's critique. God calls the act an abomination, and man responds by calling it pride.
Man. To really cement this idea of cultural escalation, the author brings in the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 5.20, which is that famous warning, Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil.
A very potent verse for this argument.
Yeah. The author is using this to explain the actual mechanism of how a society falls apart. Because it doesn't happen just because people do bad things, right?
Right.
It happens through a process the author calls catechizing.
And catechizing is a brilliant word choice by the author.
Break that down for us. What does it traditionally mean?
Well, traditionally, catechism is the formal process of teaching Christian doctrine to children or new converts, usually through repetitive questions and answers.
Right, like who made you, God made me, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It is how you build a moral worldview from the ground up in a human mind. The author argues that modern secular culture is actively catechizing its citizens, but in reverse.
Reverse catechism.
Yeah. The existential threat is not merely that a culture tolerates a sin. Toleration is one thing. The threat is when the culture deploys its institutions to actively teach its population to call that sin a profound good.
It's a complete moral inversion.
It is the systemic rewriting of reality. The author lists the symptoms of this inversion, like it happens when disorder is officially renamed love, when unchecked pride is renamed heroic authenticity, when biblical correction is legally or socially defined as hate speech, and when fundamental rebellion against the divine order is praised as self-discovery.
Wow. Okay, I want to try another analogy here to see if I'm tracking the author's logic on how society enforces this. Because it's not just the difference between someone deciding to, say, speed on the highway, knowing they are breaking the law and hoping they don't get pulled over.
Right, that's just traditional sin.
Yeah. What the author is describing is it's like a massive group of drunk drivers violently taking over the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
They shred the existing rule book. They rewrite the driving manual to state that driving sober is actually a cowardly hazard to society.
An inversion of the rules.
Yes. And then they demand that sober drivers take a breathalyzer to prove they have enough alcohol in their system to be considered safe for the road.
Wow.
They don't just want to break the law.
Yeah.
They want to become the law.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanism of Isaiah's reversal. It moves the issue entirely out of the realm of private individual struggle and into the realm of structural tyranny.
Right.
The goal is not tolerance anymore. The goal is mandatory affirmation. The culture demands that the entire society bow before this enthroned identity, treating the affirmation of it as the highest possible form of civic righteousness.
But this naturally leads to a massive question about the limits of secular power. And the author actually tackles this head on. They draw a very hard line between civil protection and metaphysical righteousness.
Yes, they do.
Because a modern listener, you listening right now, might be saying, look, we passed laws to protect these groups from being fired or harassed. That's just basic civil rights.
Which is a standard, very common secular defense.
Right. And the author doesn't necessarily argue against basic legal safety, but they make a massive philosophical distinction about what a law can actually accomplish.
The author is ruthlessly exposing the impotence of secular institutions here. Governments can pass positive laws. Massive multinational corporations can fly flags during June. Public school boards can adopt radically new curriculums.
The Supreme Court can hand down binding legal rulings.
Yeah, exactly. A society has the mechanical power to entirely protect a legal class from mistreatment or discrimination in the workplace.
But the author is saying that all of that bureaucratic paperwork, all of that institutional muscle, it doesn't actually touch the fabric of reality.
Not in the slightest, according to this theology. The author's point is that human consensus has zero metaphysical authority.
Zero.
Zero. Man can protect a category with a law, but if God has condemned the underlying act, the act remains condemned regardless of how many Supreme Court justices vote to protect it.
So the state can't make something holy.
Right. The state, the corporate HR department, the university, they do not possess the divine authority to define what is holy, what is righteous, or what actually constitutes love. The crowd does not dictate truth to the Creator.
And honestly, nothing visualizes this clash of authority better than the subject the text turns to next, which is the rainbow.
Ah, yes, the stolen symbol.
Yeah, the author takes a really fascinating detour into the history and symbolism of the rainbow, arguing that it's not just a colorful graphic design choice, but a stolen covenant symbol.
This is one of the most structurally profound and poetic sections of the entire essay. The author forces the reader to contrast the modern ubiquitous use of the pride flag with the original ancient context of the rainbow found in Genesis 9.13.
Which is the story of Noah.
Yes, in the biblical narrative, God sets the rainbow in the cloud immediately following the catastrophic global flood. It is not a generic symbol of happiness or diversity.
It's a blood covenant.
It is explicitly the token of a covenant. The author emphasizes that the rainbow is fundamentally a sign of divine restraint. It's God's mercy following immense judgment.
Restraint is a key word there.
It is. The imagery in the Hebrew text implies God taking his bow, the literal weapon of war that he used to judge the earth, and setting it down in the clouds, pointing away from humanity.
Oh, wow. I've never thought of it as a literal bow and arrow before.
Yes, it is a monument to God's self-imposed restraint against the total annihilation of a corrupt human race.
So it's a symbol that basically says, you deserve destruction, but I am withholding my weapon.
Exactly.
But the author argues that modern culture has completely stripped away that context and, inverted the symbol's direction.
Yes, and the author views this as an act of staggering cosmic arrogance.
Cosmic arrogance.
Man has taken the almighty sign of merciful restraint and repurposed it into a banner of self-affirmation. Instead of God setting the bow in the cloud as a reminder of his mercy, man has pulled the bow down from the sky and is waving it over his own flesh.
In the very midst of his corruption.
Exactly.
Okay, let me try to picture this. It's as if a coastal city was devastated by a massive tsunami, right?
Okay, go on.
And the government builds a giant warning siren to remind people of the danger and to signal grace when they survive the next storm.
Yeah.
But decades later, a new generation comes along, completely forgets about the flood, wires the tsunami siren to a DJ booth, and uses it as the bass drop for a massive beach rave.
Wow.
They're using the instrument of their own survival to celebrate the very behaviors that caused the storm in the first place.
That is exactly the kind of fatal historical amnesia the author is highlighting. The essay explicitly states, God gave the rainbow as mercy after corruption, but man flies it as pride in the midst of corruption.
That is heavy.
It elevates the culture war from a debate about civil rights into a terrifying theological rebellion. The covenant sign has been hijacked and turned into a monument to the lawless self.
And the author connects this hijacking directly to a warning from Jesus about the days of Noah.
Yes, which ties the symbol back to the prophecy.
Right. The text reminds us that Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. But the author zeroes in on a very specific phrase from the Genesis account of Noah's time. The men of renown.
The men of renown.
Yeah. Who are these people in a modern context?
Well, Genesis 6 describes these men of renown as ancient giants, the heroes of old, men of immense stature and influence. But the author functionally translates this ancient demographic into our modern technological reality.
So they aren't literal giants walking around today.
No, not physically. Today's men of renown are the entertainers, the mega celebrities, the viral influencers, the politicians, and the cultural icons. They are the image makers of the current generation.
And their function isn't just to entertain us, right? The author argues their function is to actively shape the moral imagination of the public.
They are the high priests of the new catechism we talked about earlier.
Right, a reverse catechism.
Exactly. They use their massive platforms to normalize desire, to teach the youth what is admirable, and to turn fundamental rebellion into a highly sought-after identity. They are the ones who make pride look like virtue.
This introduces a Greek word the text uses heavily, genia, which translates to generation. The author is making a point about how ideologies actually survive and replicate over time.
It's a brilliant observation about the mechanics of cultural transmission, because the author acknowledges that biological sex is required to produce physical children, bloodlines, and genetic inheritances.
Sure, biology is biology.
But they argue that empires, political orders, and spiritual ideologies reproduce civilizationally. They don't need biology.
How do they reproduce that?
They reproduce through public schools, shifts in language, movies, corporate policies, and constant moral training.
So a movement doesn't need to biologically reproduce to dominate the future. It just has to capture the genia, the generation.
Exactly. The author is arguing that pride functions as a highly aggressive genia. It is actively reproducing its doctrine through the cultural water supply.
The cultural water supply, yeah.
The physical appetite of an individual might introduce the pattern of sin, but it is the culture, the men of renown, the institutions, the media, that actually builds the temple of pride in the mind of the next generation.
Which brings us to what is arguably the core philosophical rupture between modern secular culture and traditional Christianity.
The clash of origins.
Yeah. It's the debate over the phrase, born this way. The essay tackles this head on. It contrasts the modern mandate to be born this way with the Christian mandate to be born again.
And this is where the friction really peaks.
Oh, yeah. Because if you're listening to this right now, especially if you come from a secular background, this is probably where the text feels incredibly abrasive. The idea that you don't get to own or even trust your own deep-seated identity goes against every single message we are fed from birth in the modern West.
It is the exact opposite of modern individualism.
So how does the author expect a modern reader to actually swallow this?
The author expects the reader to swallow it by applying a cold, surgical logic to the concept of human desire. The entire modern cultural argument rests on a very specific premise.
Which is?
If a desire is unchosen, if it manifests innately from early childhood, then it must be natural. And if it is natural, it must be inherently good, and therefore it is worthy of public affirmation.
Okay, yeah, that is the standard argument.
But the author takes a sledgehammer to that premise. They argue that whether a desire is chosen or unchosen is completely irrelevant to its holiness.
Wow, that is a massive, earth-shattering paradigm shift. Because the entire cultural conversation revolves around origins. Like, I didn't choose to be attracted to this, therefore it can't be a sin.
Right.
But the author says, so what?
The author essentially says, I concede the point that you didn't choose the desire, but your premise is still fatally flawed. The text argues, a desire being unchosen does not make it holy. A desire being deep does not make it righteous.
Because humans are born flawed.
Exactly. The author points out that Christianity, from its inception, has never taught that everything a person is born with should be affirmed. In fact, referencing Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, the fundamental message of the gospel isn't therapeutic self-discovery.
It isn't peeling back the layers of societal expectation to find the truest version of your flesh so you can celebrate it.
No, the message is an execution. It's death and resurrection. Jesus literally says, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. You have to start over.
Right, and here is the piercing, undeniable logic the author uses to address the individual's lived experience. The author separates the raw, fleshly desire from the conscious operation of the human will.
This is the crux of the argument.
The author says, let's assume the sexual identity is completely unchosen. Even if that desire is unchosen, the pride is chosen.
Yes.
Wow, let me just repeat that so it sinks in for you listening. You may claim you did not choose the desire, but you completely choose what you are proud of.
That is the ultimate distillation of the argument. The celebration is an act of the will. The public enthronement is an act of the will.
Because buying a flag, chanting a slogan in the street, joining a political movement, and demanding that your family or your employer affirm you.
Those are not unchosen biological imperatives. Those are highly calculated, entirely chosen acts of human volition.
So the issue isn't that a broken human being experiences a broken desire. The issue is what the ego decides to do with it once it surfaces.
Yes. Does the will submit the desire to God? Does it confess it as a fracture of the fall, discipline it, seek healing, and drag it to the foot of the cross?
Or
Does the will polish it, crown it, parade it through the streets, and demand worshipful affirmation for it? It all comes back to the architecture of the temple. Who is sitting on the throne making the decisions?
wow. To highlight what the author sees as the sheer hypocritical inconsistency of how modern culture handles this exact issue of human will and identity, the text introduces a very provocative legal comparison.
Yes, the identity machine.
Right. It looks at the mechanics of what we'll call the identity machine and the paradox of the sex offender. Now, before we get into this, we need to put up the exact same massive caveat the author does.
Absolutely essential. We have to be very clear here.
Yes. The author goes out of their way to explicitly state that this comparison is not a defense of coercion, exploitation, abuse, or violation in any form.
Not at all.
The text explicitly names those actions as wicked, predatory behaviors that must be severely judged by both God and man. The author is not excusing harm.
Right. The author is using this extreme contrast to expose a glaring societal contradiction in how we manufacture permanent labels for human beings.
The observation is sociological.
Yes. The author points out that modern society is perfectly comfortable judging, restricting, and permanently labeling certain sexual behaviors. Society operates a massive legal machinery that creates permanent civil categories, like the sex offender registry. It takes a specific sexual conduct and attaches it to a permanent, inescapable public identity that is characterized by profound, legally mandated social stigma and shame.
So society is fully capable of looking at a human being and saying, your sexual behavior defines your fundamental identity, and we are going to permanently brand you with a scarlet letter for it.
Yes, society has no problem doing that. But then the author notes that exact same society, using the exact same identity machine, turns around and dictates that a different sexual identity must not only be tolerated, but actively, joyfully celebrated.
It's a complete paradox.
It is. One sexual category is assigned permanent shame, while another is assigned permanent pride. One is branded by the state, the other is crowned by the state.
And that creates a terrifying sociological whiplash.
It really does.
It's like society wants the power to be the ultimate judge and jury of the human soul. But its rule book is written in pencil and changes depending on the political winds of the decade.
That's exactly it.
Society decides which desires get you a parade with corporate sponsorships and which desires get you exiled to the margins of humanity.
And the author argues that this proves human consensus is a fundamentally unstable and terrifying foundation for ultimate morality. Man labels according to political convenience and cultural trends.
But God doesn't.
No. God, the author argues, judges according to a static, eternal, unchanging standard based on truth, righteousness, covenant, harm, repentance, and repair. God doesn't require a politically manufactured stigma machine to discern right from wrong.
He judges the act as it is.
He judges the act as it is. But man morphs conduct into a permanent identity when it desires condemnation, and morphs conduct into a sacred identity when it desires celebration.
The author bluntly concludes this section with a devastating summary. God is not confused. Man is.
That's a very sharp point.
It is a heavy, relentless critique of secular culture. And at this point in the essay, a certain type of reader, perhaps a traditional religious reader, might be nodding along feeling incredibly vindicated.
Oh, they might be cheering.
Right. They might be thinking, yes, the author really nailed the culture out there. But the author doesn't let anyone off the hook.
No, the blade swings both ways.
The text demands that this massive, critical lens be immediately turned inward onto every single person reading it. The author holds up a universal mirror.
And this is where the sheer structural integrity of the essay proves it isn't just a political hit piece.
It's not just culture war fodder.
Exactly. It is a universal theological mandate. The author insists that if the biological body is the temple, and there are roughly 8 billion bodies walking the earth right now, then there are 8 billion temples.
Every single person.
Every single individual, without exception, is forced to answer the exact same question. What is currently seated in my temple?
So it's not just about the pride flag.
No. The author argues that the LGBTQ plus pride movement is just a public forerunner. It happens to be the most visible, loudly institutionalized, flag-waving example of self-enthronement in the current cultural moment. But the underlying pattern of lawlessness, the pattern of putting the ego on the throne, is entirely universal.
The text fires off a rapid-fire list of examples to prove that pride is an indiscriminate occupier.
Yeah.
It doesn't care what your politics are.
Pride is an equal opportunity destroyer. The author writes that pride can sit comfortably in the lust of a straight, traditional man just as easily as it sits in a rainbow parade.
Wow.
It can sit in the heart of a megachurch preacher who has fallen deeply in love with his own pastoral authority and platform.
Oh, that's a big one.
It can sit in a conservative politician who views himself as the indispensable savior of his nation, or a patriot who subtly begins to worship his country over his God.
Or what about the intellectuals?
Yeah, it can sit in the university intellectual who worships the processing power of his own mind, or the religious moralist who worships his own strict behavioral correctness.
Or even the victim.
Yes, the marginalized victim who builds a permanent throne out of their own historical grievances.
That last one is incredibly potent. The idea that even victimhood can become a throne. Even the pride of simply being right about the theological arguments we've just spent the last hour discussing can become the lawless idols sitting in the temple.
Which naturally brings up a major, unavoidable objection.
A plank in the eye.
Exactly. The text references the famous biblical warning from Jesus about the plank in the eye and the danger of hypocrisy. Because if the author is sitting here passing severe, unyielding judgment on modern culture, how do they reconcile that with Jesus' command? Judge not, that you be not judged.
How does the author resolve that tension?
They resolve it by drawing a profound distinction between the nature of hypocrisy and the nature of witness.
Hypocrisy versus witness. Okay, explain that.
Hypocrisy, the author argues, is the act of condemning another person's sin while actively, secretly preserving your own ego.
The hypocrite stands on a pedestal.
Right. They stand on a pedestal and say, your fleshly sin is an abomination, but my religious pride is entirely justified.
It's throwing stones from behind a bulletproof glass of self-righteousness.
That's a great way to put it. But the author claims that a true Christian witness does not stand outside the blast radius of the judgment.
They aren't safe behind the glass.
No. True witness says, I am standing first in line under the blade of this text. If there is a plank in my eye, the author says, let that plank be the cross.
Wow. Let that plank be the cross. So the true witness doesn't point at the culture and say, only your flesh must die because you are wrong.
No, the true witness says, my flesh must die first. My pride, my ego, my ambition, it all must be crucified first.
The witness speaks from underneath the exact same cross they are pointing the culture toward.
They are acknowledging that their own internal temple is prone to idolatry and needs violent cleansing just as desperately as the streets of the culture do.
And this brings the entire thesis of the essay to its ultimate, dramatic, and unavoidable conclusion. If the great villain of humanity is the self-enthroned ego, and the crisis is internal, what is the antidote? How do you evict the lawless one?
And the author answers with the only mechanism capable of killing the ego, the crucified life.
The crucified life.
Yes. The resolution relies heavily on 3 key scriptures, and we need to look at the mechanics of each one. Let's start with the Apostle Paul in Galatians 2.20.
Okay, Galatians 2.20.
The author describes Galatians 2.20 as the blade through the whole thing. The verse famously declares, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me.
I am crucified.
The author forces the reader to contrast this ancient declaration with the mantras of modern therapy and culture. Paul doesn't write, I finally discovered my authentic self and learned to be proud of it.
He doesn't say, my innate natural desires are the compass for my highest truth.
He says, I am crucified. He declares himself legally and spiritually dead.
That is the baseline Christian identity, according to this theological framework. It is the absolute antithesis of self-affirmation. It is self-crucifixion.
Pride says, this is who I am, universe, you must affirm me. Galatians says, it is no longer I who live. The author argues that it is philosophically and spiritually impossible for those two spirits to sit on the same throne. One must die for the other to rule.
The essay then brings in the apocalyptic vision of Revelation 12.11, which describes how the saints ultimately defeated the dragon.
Yes.
It says, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death.
The author zeroes in on the mechanism of that victory in the final phrase. They loved not their lives unto the death.
How does that apply here?
Well, the overcomers in the book of Revelation do not survive the apocalypse by loving themselves into a state of affirmation. They do not cling to their biological existence or their self-expression as the highest possible good, demanding that their identity must survive at all costs.
They surrender it completely, even unto physical death.
Exactly. Pride says, my life is mine, it is sacred, it must be celebrated. Revelation says the exact opposite. The only way to win is to let go of your life entirely.
And this leads to perhaps the most intense, abrasive extrapolation in the entire text, using the words of Jesus in Luke 14.26.
This one is tough for a lot of people.
It really is. Jesus says that if anyone comes to him and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be his disciple.
We have to unpack the mechanism of this extreme language.
Yes, because listeners might hear the word hate and think this theology is just a cult calling for self-harm or the destruction of the family unit.
The author is highly meticulous in clarifying this point. Christ is not commanding petty, emotional cruelty, carnal hatred, or physical self-harm.
So what does hate mean in this context?
The author explains that Jesus is using extreme comparative language to declare the absolute unrivaled supremacy of God over every natural human attachment.
Okay, so it's about priorities.
Yes. The text explains that even the most beautiful, sacred, earthly bonds, your devotion to your family, your marriage, and especially your innate instinct for self-love and self-preservation, they cannot sit above Christ.
They cannot occupy the throne room of the temple.
They have to be subordinate.
Vastly subordinate.
The disciple must hate his own life in comparison to his absolute allegiance to the Creator. The old man, the biological ego, the flesh, the concept of the self as the lord of its own destiny, that entity must be put to death.
It is a divine command to crucify the false, autonomous self so that the true, spiritually regenerated self can actually draw breath.
Which means when a believer looks at the culture or looks in the mirror and says, I am not proud, They aren't just expressing low self-esteem.
They aren't throwing a pity party or being falsely humble.
Not at all. The author elevates that simple phrase into something massive. I am not proud is profound apocalyptic temple language. It is a sweeping theological declaration of war against the ego.
It means I actively refuse to enthrone my flesh.
Yes, I categorically refuse to worship my biological or psychological identity. I will not seat my own intellect, desires, or politics in the temple of my mind and call them God. I am crucified.
Wow. So synthesizing this entire journey, the author is demanding that we zoom out. The ultimate cultural and spiritual war happening on Earth right now isn't the petty, exhausting political battles we see on the cable news ticker.
Not at all.
It's not a small, localized culture war of straight versus gay or conservative versus liberal.
That framing is laughably small compared to what the author is describing. The massive, cosmic, overarching spiritual war of human history is pride versus crucifixion.
It is the self-enthroned ego versus Christ-enthroned.
It is the lawless one seated comfortably in the temple of the mind versus the Holy Spirit dwelling in the temple. As the author brilliantly summarizes the dichotomy, it is the mandate to express yourself versus the mandate to deny yourself.
It is the modern worship of my truth versus the submission to the truth.
It is the biological resignation of being born this way versus the miraculous, violent resurrection of being born again.
We have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today. We've traced the author's argument from a radical, internal redefinition of where the end times temple actually is.
Yes, moving it from a building to the body.
We've explored the theology of pride, proving it isn't a feeling, but the ultimate architectural act of self-enthronement. We unpack the mechanics of how a culture catechizes its citizens,
The reverse catechism.
right? And the repurposing of the ancient rainbow symbol, from divine restraint to self-affirmation, and the deep philosophical clash between secular identity and the crucified life.
And finally, we saw how the author demands that everyone look in the universal mirror, insisting that every human being, regardless of their background, is faced with the absolute necessity of dethroning the ego.
It is a relentless, structurally airtight argument based on its own foundational premises.
It leaves absolutely no room for the ego to hide. Whether that ego is wrapped in a colorful pride flag, a patriotic political banner, an intellectual's tweed jacket, or a pastor's holy robe, the blade swings equally at everyone.
And that brings us directly to you, the listener. We've spent this time breaking down the architecture of this author's worldview. But regardless of your personal religious beliefs, regardless of your politics, your voting record, or your sexual identity, this text forces a profound, universal psychological inventory. Look at the invisible sanctuary of your own mind. Who or what is currently sitting on the throne making the ultimate decisions about what is right and wrong?
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought, extrapolating this ancient theology into our modern, increasingly secular reality. If, as this author vehemently argues, the ultimate conflict of humanity is this internal, fatal battle against self-enthronement, how does an entirely secular, non-religious worldview ever actually solve the problem of the ego?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. Without a divine framework to surrender to, without a cross to crucify the false self upon, does modern society have any real mechanism to keep the human ego in check?
Or, without the divine, are we inevitably doomed to just keep building endless, exhausting temples to our own desires, worshiping ourselves until the entire structure collapses?
It's the ultimate paradox.
We spend so much time looking for the villain out there, pointing at the horizon, waiting for the monster to arrive so we can fight it. But the hardest battle you will ever fight is the one that starts when you finally realize the monster's already in the room and it's wearing your face. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring the architecture of the ideas that shape our world, and we'll see you next time.